Now, what exactly are the biological signals that we can potentially incorporate within the symbiotic intelligence integration framework? At the moment, the type of technology that we have is obviously video, obviously text, but more importantly, we do have access to other type of biological signals such as heart rate variability, skin conductance, etc. And it's important to understand what these biological signals communicate on the human end, which is the analog version of information transfer, with the potential next generation machines, which is the digital world of transferring, communicating, and translating information. And so it would be a marriage of the analog world, which is in this case the biological form of humans, with the digital world, which is the digital world of the machines. And the way in which information is transferred within these two worlds are very different. And so we need to come up with a way in which these two worlds can communicate, because information is how we translate and transform data. Essentially, it is the underlying neutrinos of the world, so to speak, the smallest entity that is at hand when it comes to communication. At this point, there are 6 different pillars where symbiotic intelligence draws from when it comes to the human biology. I personally have had experience in all of these 6 pillars, be it in the academia where I actually worked in the lab and or did the literature review, as well as some of which correspond to my own PhD. So first of all is the visual perception. I spent most of my undergrad working at a visual perception lab at the university, where I was gathering data for many hours in the lab for the professor. And then my time at the SPAN lab, which was the neuroeconomics, where you look at how reward systems, for example, work at the neurological level. I spent 1 year during also my undergrad in that lab. And then the literature review and also my own undergrad work, which had to do with affective science in terms of different basic emotions that humans have and how that impact our decision making. And then also in combination, the affective modulation and visual scope of that. And then for my grad studies, I engaged in the neurological aspect of information processing model. And lastly, the literature review in terms of how the heart also communicates a lot of that information at the heart rate level, as well as heart rate variability level. So let's first look at the visual perception, at least in the lab that I was being a research assistant to Dr. Lam. Essentially, the professor, and in this case, the lit review, proved that there is a global versus local visual perception and visual focus within humans that is a covert mental state is being communicated. And so, for example, there is a way in which we look at something, we look at it at a global level, meaning to say you just sort of see the face, you don't see the details. But then there's a local way of looking at objects where, for example, you look at the specific eye movement, or nose and whatnot. And so that is what it's called, the global versus local visual focus. And so a few things that happened was that based on this research framework, the pupil of the eye, the dynamics of it, the micro squints or the gaze dispersion, they instantly reveal whether, for example, an individual is in a broad and holistic or global visual mode. In other words, are they just scanning or exploring, versus whether they are in a narrow, detail-oriented or local focus mode, which is when you are extremely focused, you're in the analysis point and you have like very narrow vision, so to speak. There's also something called covert spatial vector, where these really micro and subtle eye region muscles, there's a tension between them where it indicates that the individual's brain is covertly shifting its spatial focus between 200 and 400 milliseconds, for example, before their head or the eyes physically move in order to look at something. And more importantly, there's a cognitive load versus visual friction that happens where, for example, these autonomic arousal that happens within, let's say, a pupil of a person, is that tension usually indicates when an individual is switching between global versus local visual processing mode, which is then causing, for example, the mental strain, confusion, hesitation, or a way in which they determine that they have clarity or they are less stressed. And the second layer has to do with the neuroeconomics, and more specifically the pleasure seeking versus something where something is attractive or not. And that has to do a lot with, for example, it's being discussed in neuroeconomics. And when I was in that lab, Professor Knudsen then proved that, for example, the brain runs on a subcortical gain versus loss calculation before, for example, an action happen. And so in this case, for example, there are some very subtle cognitive shifts that is happening, that it's, for example, making a person feel like, okay, this is how I would react towards approaching something that I think is going to be pleasant to me, whether in other hand, if it's something that I should avoid because it's going to be a non-pleasant experience, or approach of reward versus risk. That is how they explain it. And so, for example, when it comes to approach or reward anticipation, it appears that neurologically there is a subtle facial or micro approaches, but also cognitively, where we looked at the fMRI of these individuals, where there are subtle shifts in specific regions of the brain that we don't need to go into, where versus when there was avoidance or risk anticipation, where that same subcortical of the brain was actually being lit during these fMRI. And in these fMRI workloads, for example, it proved that the brain actually calculates the expected reward in nucleus accumbens versus expected risk or loss in the insular region of the brain before, for example, a decision is made. And today, these subcortical reward versus threat anticipation, they also leak directly into the autonomic and semantic nervous system. And that was that would be the second pillar in which we can extract these biological signals in order to know what an individual is experiencing. The next pillar is in regards to the subtle, minute ways in which we express, for example, the most inner state that a lot of us most of the time want to even hide. But it is very clear, for example, when we have ways in which we can read facial expressions and all the very, very minute expressions on the face, not to mention the body language. And those are the what Professor Ekman, for example, was defining as very basic emotions, where he talked about, for example, sadness, happiness, anger, and so forth. But more importantly, also I want to mention Dr. Fredrickson's work, where there is a way that I'm sure you've heard a lot about, where you say you had a tunnel vision versus a broad type of vision. And that was part of my own undergrad research papers, where there are ways in which we can test and look at where people have a different type of vision when they look at things. And that is directly correlated with the underlying state within a person that he or she feels. For example, again, going into pleasant versus unpleasant states. When there are pleasant states that are connected with positive emotions, then we tend to have more of a broad vision. And so when we test these, either in rats, in labs, for me it was on humans, they tend to look at the labyrinth or the things that they're about to solve more broadly, whereas if they were feeling some unpleasant state within themselves, let's say sadness and whatnot, then the vision immediately went into being a tunnel vision. And there is a perfect explanation for that, and that is because, for example, at a biological level, when we are feeling threatened, so to speak, it's very important that we pay attention to details, because at that point we're trying to protect ourselves and maybe leave the situation or attack the threat that is imminent. And that is why we need to go into tunnel vision. And that's why, for example, a lot of times when people are stressed at a tunnel vision, and that tunnel vision is what contributes to, for example, the person reacting to things in a more, let's say, negative way, or is not able to look at the broader version. And that goes back to Dr. Fredrickson, who talked about and displayed those, made those research. Okay, and then the next one has to do with the information processing, and that has to do with Dr. Kulthau's ISP framework, which is the information search process model. And in that case, it was also part of my own grad level studies, that where I looked at the neurological, more specifically the electrical neurological level, not the your traditional neuroscience, but the EEG part, the brain electrical activities. And that is where you have, for example, different stages in which a person goes through when we are looking for information, looking for answers, looking for knowledge, which again, it's the neutrinos of the world. Data and information is the thing that connects everything together. It's essentially what everything in this world is about. Data is about information, is about knowledge, and about that, communicating that. And that is where all these processes lie. And so the main, three of the main stages in which we take when we are looking for information is when we are innately feeling very not at ease, uncertain, and which is more about feeling unpleasant. And that is why, for example, we're seeking information. That phase is called the exploration phase. And then the other two phases are formulation and collection. And formulation is where we take a stance. We're like, okay, I don't feel good about this. I need more information. I need to understand this thing or this person better. And that is when we go into and formulate what it is that we're looking for. And then the next stage would be the collection phase, which is the collection information. And so in those phases, also there are a lot of internal state that are involved, starting from exploration, which is the non-pleasant states, versus formulation, which is a bit calmer, and collection, which becomes a very positive, hopefully. But also the electrical activities of the brain, in this case EEG, which is, by the way, very much at the surface. So it's not like LFP where you dig in and know exactly what the brainwaves frequencies are, but it is at a scalp level. And then last but not least is Dr. Radin's work, where you look at not only the EEG but also the heart. So you're combining the electrical activities of the heart and the brain, and you're also able to some extent determine what a person's internal state is when they are anticipating reward versus anticipating a threat. So it's all about anticipation and whatnot. And lastly, I also want to mention that a lot of these things is about the predictive model of how humans' biology work, because in nature, in general, when it has to do with our evolution, is that we have to be able to anticipate stuff, anticipate things that are happening to us, whether it's good or bad, mainly because we need to make those decisions. And a lot of these anticipation or predictive models are actually innately within the human body programmed. That's because we have to be such a way in order to just be able to evolve. It's basic human evolution. And the same thing is for animals. It's just that we don't have a lot of research on them. But if you think about it, the same goes for the machines, whether they are LLMs, whether they are just machine learning in general, or whether they are robotics. It also, for them, has to do with a predictive model. Essentially, everything is about prediction. That is how we can make sense of the world. And so that is where that connection exists between the analog world of the biology and the digital world of the machine. That is the common thread, so to speak, where the symbiotic intelligence can make that connection. And lastly, to make it a little bit more tangible, I do want to mention the list in which we can, for example, use the current technology that we have, and hopefully in the future our technology would be even more advanced so we can collect more. But essentially there are ways in which we can gather all that biological intelligence. So for example, if you remember when we talked about the visual perception, that is the covert spatial attention global versus local processing model. In this case, we could get that information biosignals from the camera, where you're tracking these micro movements in terms of pupil dynamics and gaze vectors and so forth. When it comes to the neurological aspect in terms of the, for example, the reward versus risk when it comes to neuroeconomics type of research, you still have, although you don't have fMRI, of course, wearable fMRI yet, but there are still ways in which you can infer what is potentially happening in the brain. So it's, for example, again, a video that facial micro expressions. Again, you're not exactly reading the way in which you can read the brain from an fMRI machine, which is extremely complicated. In this case, you're just inferring, so to speak. And then the next one is the affective science. This one is pretty easy because it's been done a lot. For example, high frame rate video tracking in terms of the facial action unit. This is pretty straightforward. The broader versus the tunnel vision versus the broad vision, this is the affective modulation. Again, you can read those specific muscle tension from the from the face and as well as some parts of the body as well. The ISP model, the information search process model, you can also infer these from heart as well as from pupil and some micro expressions, not exactly straightforward. And then lastly, the heart rate and heart rate variability that we talked about that predictive model analysis, all of which these biosignals are to some extent. Now, to make all these work holistically, from a not only an academic and scientific point of view, but also from a productization point of view, something that you can actually incorporate as an integration layer into next generation robotics, machine learning, and so forth, is there is a way in the back end to combine these biological signals. And there is an art to it, because you do need to be very scientific about it, but also not too academic that you can't really turn it into a product, so to speak. And that's where, for example, symbiotic intelligence comes in. And so the idea is that the algorithm and the mashup of all the biosignals, not only these but others, that we can extract from the biosignals wearables, for example, mash them up in the back end and write that algorithm. That's what the symbiotic intelligence layer does. And then be able to, for example, deliver it, let's say, to a developer. Like, let's say you're a developer, and this would be like a normal API that you would get from anywhere. And that API, you can plug it in. And in that case, you could incorporate that symbiotic intelligence integration framework with, for example, let's say you're working on an open source LLM or a robotic software and whatnot. And the idea here is not that you're an academic person. You're actually, let's say, creating a product, but you want to combine that with the human biology, not from a health and clinical and that perspective, but from delivering the next generation machine learning to make them not only more efficient but also more intelligent, because you are piggybacking on the human biology intelligence and efficiency of compute. Because the whole premise of symbiotic intelligence is to be able to piggyback off one another, the analog world versus the digital world, where the collaboration, if you will, is going to help not only with understanding one another, but also in efficiency and compute, because compute is a huge aspect of it. And the biology by itself is already extremely efficient in that way, but so is the machines. So are the machines in that way, whether they are actually LLMs or robotics, doesn't matter. But the underlying artificial neural network are extremely efficient, but so are the biological neural network. So both of them are extremely efficient in their own way. But the premise of symbiotic intelligence is the coexistence and cooperation of the two, if that makes sense. Okay, that's all I had for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time. Bye.